welcome. I'm Pauline from PQW, and I'm so glad you're going to join me with this class. We're going to go through how to finish off the edge of the quilt, how to get that really nice finish. You know, you can call it the finishing touch, or you might like to call it getting a perfect edge. There's so many ways we can finish our quilt. So I'm just going to take you through a few different ways I like to finish my quilt and different bindings that we like to use. But let me start by showing you the tools that I like to use to make the edges come out the way I want them to. I use the Duo tool, this tool here, to cut my binding strips, because I usually cut my binding strips 2.5 inches wide. This ruler is exactly 2.5 inches wide, so you can use this to cut all your strips. And I fold my fabric into 4, so this ruler fits right across the width of a fabric that's folded into 4. It has this angle here that will allow you to get that perfect angle join when you're joining your binding pieces, strips together. And also I use this end to do that end join in the binding. And I'm going to show you how to do all of that. The other lines that are marked on this are used for totally different things, and we'll do that in another lesson. But we're just going to basically use the width of the ruler and these 2 lines here to do our bindings. The other thing I use is my sasha tools. These tools I designed many, many years ago for doing just exactly what we're doing. This pack here comes with a 1 1/8 and a 1 1/4 sasha tool. Now, the reason I've put 2 together in a pack is sometimes we like to do a binding and cut it 2.5 inches wide. When we fold a 2.5 inch wide strip in half, it measures 1 1/4 inches. Hence, we'd use the 1 1/4 inch sasha tool to push the tool with the iron. That will give us a lovely, lovely straight strip of folded piece of binding. The 1 1/8 inch tool, we cut our strips 1 1/4 inches wide. 2 1/4 inches wide. When we fold that in half, it comes down to 1 1/8. So we're going to use those. I'm going to show you how you can use the 3/8 of an inch sasha tool to do some little trims on your binding. And then we've now come up with the magic binding tool. This is a tool that we're going to use that will do a binding with a peeper, strip or a flange, whatever you like to call it. But it's like that little piping along the edge of your binding. So we've got a lot of options. So let's get started. Oh, and the other tool that we use to do all of our bindings is the Roxanne glue baster. I'm going to show you how important this is to me, whether I machine stitch my bindings down or whether I hand stitch them. This is a great tool to use. Now, one of the things that I find is a common problem with doing your bindings, you know, we've made this beautiful quilt. We've spent so much time piecing it together, getting everything accurate on it. Then we quilt it, or we may get it quilted by somebody else, or you may use my quilt as you go technique. Whichever way you get your quilt finished, a lot of the times the outside edges stretch. And they're obviously going to stretch because fabric's cut on different grains, there's different amount of quantities of quilting done on it, different battings used, so it's nearly impossible to end up with a quilt that's even on the middle and both sides, and also across the middle and both top and bottom. So if you want a really, really lovely finish to your quilt, it's worth taking the time at this stage before you put the binding on. So for example, I'm going to get this is just a little sample that we're going to work on. So the quilt's already quilted, beautifully quilted. Now, what I need to do is measure the top of the quilt, regardless of how big the quilt is. Just get your tape measure, and you might need a big, long tape measure. This one makes a noise. We're just going to measure across the top. Oops. So mine's measuring 33 1/4 at the top. Now I'm going to measure across the middle. It's measuring 33 inches. Measuring the other end, and I've already measured that, I know it measures 34 inches. So I've got 3 different measurements. If I just now go and put a binding on this, I could expect if I hung this quilt, it would be wavy down the edges. It won't sit very flat. So what I do And what I suggest you do if you want to take the time to do it is just simply find the halfway of your quilt. You can fold your quilt in half to find the halfway, if that's the way you want to do it, or you can measure it with a tape measure. Pop a pin in where you have that halfway mark. Then between this halfway mark and this edge, find the quarter. Once again, you can fold it over, find the quarter. You can do it from the right side or the wrong side, it doesn't matter. And then we do the same this edge. So now we have it really nicely quartered up, so each division is exactly equal. Now what we do is just use a regular needle and cotton. You can use a double thread or a single thread, entirely up to you. And really, on a really lovely big quilt, it's so worth the time doing this. It will take you a bit of time. Just sit at a tabletop and just take your time. Put some really, really nice music on or a good audio book or put a movie on. Do this. Start with a knot and we're just going to come in about not quite a 1/4 inch from the edge and just do some running stitches. Now I'll just get started and so just some nice running stitches. Try and keep them fairly even. And when we get down to this pin, we will do a little bit of easing up. So we'll come along. You know, and if you don't like hand sewing, it's a bit of a chore, but let me tell you, it is so worth it. Maybe, you know, have a nice cup of tea sitting at the side that you can stop and take a sip of tea, or have a friend over and, if we're allowed to, and sit and chat. Now, I would unthread the needle at that stage. All right, so I'm just going to cut this thread. Now, we will start again. Just put a knot in the needle. And I just hold my needle up, I put the thread down and I wrap the thread around there about 4 times, pull the thread down between my finger and thumb and up. Then I've got a lovely knot, as you can see there. Now we'll start exactly where we finished and we'll keep gathering. And we'll do that all the way across. We're not going to do it all the way across here to take up your time, just so long as you get the idea. Then what we'll do, once we've done this top and the bottom, because my middle measurement was 33 inches, remember I had 33 inches, 33 and 1/4 and 34 inches, so the other end is going to be the worst. But what I would do once I've got this all gathered is I will pull the tail of this thread where I finished the first lot of thread, just pull it so this just ever so slightly gathers. You'll hardly notice that you're pulling it in because the batting in that absorbs that gathering. So I'm just pulling this in about, you know, this end we don't need to pull in much at all because it's only 1/4 inch different to the end. I then wrap figure 8 this thread, this tail of the thread. It's a bit hard to get it in there so the camera can pick this up. Figure 8 around that to secure that thread off. Now that won't move. So you'll do that at each one of these sections, on the top and the bottom, till you get it exactly the same measurement as your centre. Or if this end's narrower than the centre, that makes it a little bit harder because you can't expand it, and it's hard to pull the centre of your quilt in. But usually 99% of the time it is the centre that is the smallest measurement. Once you've done the top and the bottom of your quilt, you would measure through the centre across the quilt, and you would do the same on the both sides. You'd find the common measurement and you would pull it in to be that measurement. Now that gathering stitch will hold your edge of your quilt absolutely perfect while you put your binding on. So just use that as a little tip if you really want to get a neat finish to the edge of your quilt. Now, let's go on to just explaining about some normal processes of a normal binding. I just need to get my little workboard here. Now, I've got some strips cut here, 2.5 inches wide. I've used the ruler to cut them. And when I want to do my join, I'm just going to use this line here. Use the selvage so you can see. This line, the edge of my fabric, is going to go on to this line here. Then I'm going to, you can use your rotary cutter and just simply cut that off, or if you're not game to cut it with a rotary cutter, draw the line and then cut with the scissors. So that will give you a lovely angle join. And then when you join all of your strips together, you've got all of these nice angles. And you can have them going the same way or different. It depends what sort of look that you want. Doing a scrappy binding, sometimes it can look really interesting to have your diagonal joins going in opposite directions, because it just adds interest to the quilt. Once we've got the binding strip cut, it's just as simple as anything. Fold your strip in half. Now, normally we stand at the ironing board and we fold and we press and, you know, we go all the way down trying to get it all even, and we end up burning our fingers, and it takes an awful long time to do it. So to save yourself time, save yourself burning your fingers and everything, use the 1 1/4 inch tool. 2.5 inch wide strip folds back to 1 1/4. Now, we can guarantee that our tools are perfect because we're the designer of the tools. We can guarantee that your tool will not melt if it's used the way it should be used. So we're going to go up and down. We're going to pin into our ironing surface, and I like to use the double fork pin. This is a twin pin. I like it because I've got the 2 prongs going in together, and it gives really nice tension to the fabric so it doesn't warp or move anywhere. Just fold the fabric in half and put a little bit of tension on the fabric, just to keep it a little bit taut. Don't put a lot of tension on it because you don't want to stretch your fabric. This curve here suits the side of any iron. You know, you'll probably use your big iron. I just love using the mini iron. But whatever iron you're using, they're all curved at the side, so the tool is designed to fit the iron. Tension on your fabric and you just push. And really, doing a binding like this can't get any easier. And I'm sure you will not burn your fingers. And I can assure you that your strip will come out perfect because ours are designed the way they should be. So you just keep going down till you get the whole thing done. Now, I get asked by a lot of people, what happens when you get to the join? So let's put that strip through that's got the joins in it so you can see what happens when we get to the join. So we've got the seams all going the one way. We've made sure that they're all facing the same direction. I want that seam pressed in the direction that we're going to be pressing with the iron. Once again, fold it in half. And you just need to press about 2 or 3 inches, enough to be able to get it into the tool accurate. Hold the tool by the handle, go up and back down. Then we pin. Once again, hold it nice and firm so it doesn't twist and move. Because if you don't hold the fabric is going to move, which means it's hard for the iron to stay against the edge of the tool. So we'll just now push with the iron again. And you can see how it just came over that seam as easy as anything. If you have any difficulties getting over that seam because your fabrics might be a bit stiffer, they might be a bit thicker, whatever reason, when you're getting close to this seam, when you get there, tap the tool with the iron. Just keep coming down, tap, and that will take it straight over that seam for you. And then you have no trouble. It just sits perfectly flat on both sides for you. Now, if you can have a look at this quilt over here, we have hanging here, you can see where we've used different fabrics. And because this quilt was made out of a jelly roll, I had some jelly roll strips left over, and they're 2.5 inches wide, and I thought, why not join them on the angle and make a different coloured binding? So, like, we've got all different lengths going around the quilt, so we've got all different intersections of where they've joined, but it just gives a nice look to the edge of the quilt, and it's a good way of using up all your scraps. The other thing you can do is we can make a binding like this one with a flange or a piping around the edge. We can do this piping as different widths, and I'm going to show you a different couple of ways of doing this. This quilt here, we've got a much narrower little flange or peeper strip going around the edge of the binding. You just need to decide what size you want to do. And in the PDF notes that come with this class that you can download, I've got all the measurements written there for you. So you'll be able to work out what sort of style of binding that you want to do on your quilts. But before we go on to making these sort of bindings, to make it exciting for you, I want to show you how I join my ends. Because I find that going all the way around the quilt and you come back to the join where you've got to join those long strips together, it can be a challenge for a lot of people. So I just want to show you with the tool how we can make that easy for you. So we've got these little samples here. So yes, we've pressed the binding, we've stitched it on with a 1/4 inch seam, we've come all the way around, but before we start putting the binding on, we need to leave ourselves a 12-inch gap. Now, from this tip of the ruler to this end of the ruler is exactly 12 inches. So get your fabric marking pen, mark both ends of the rulers onto your quilt. Then you'll need to leave yourself about a 10 or a 12-inch tail before you start stitching. And you'll need about that same amount left over when you finish stitching. We're going to start sewing right on that mark that we put on the quilt. We'll start sewing right there. We'll come all the way around. We'll get back to here, and we'll stop stitching. Then we need to, somewhere on these pieces that we have left over, we need to mark a line somewhere about halfway along this length here. So if you just use this line on the ruler and just put it down and put a little mark there, mark across, then you need to line this line. These two lines have to run exactly at the same measurement. So you'll mark that one. Open this out, and you can do this straight onto your cutting board if you feel confident cutting this off straight away. If you're doing it for the first time, you may want to draw the lines like I have here and then cut it with the scissors once you're sure it's right. You're going to line this line here on the ruler exactly on this line, and you're going to draw or cut across here. And you will note that the ruler's got this little nip cut off the end. It doesn't come right out to the end of the ruler. We've cut it off. That's very important because that'll help you align up the edges later on. Do that side. Fold this one out. You're going to just rotate the ruler. You're not going to turn the ruler over, you're just going to rotate it. Align this line up on this line, and you're going to do exactly the same thing. Draw it or cut it, whichever you feel comfortable doing. Then when we come back to this, we've got our ends cut the way we wanted them. You're just going to lay them right sides together Now you can see that, oops, I'll just get this so you can get it. This little nib where it was cut straight off aligns with the edge of the binding. So you would pop a pin in there. Just grab a pin. You'd come across to this side. You've got the little nip on that side. It'll line up with exactly with this side of the binding. You will pin that. Then you'll go to your sewing machine and sew across there with an exact 1/4 inch seam. And your 1/4 inch seam should come right off at the end of that little nib that you cut off. And once you sew across there, press your seam going to one direction. Then that fits that spot absolutely perfect spot on. So you're not going to have any bulk here. It takes a little bit of time to do it, but it really does work superbly for you. Now, the other thing you can do, like if this was the right side of my quilt and I stitch the binding on from the right side, we're obviously going to turn it over to the back and we're either going to hand or machine stitch it. But I find it's very hard if I want to machine stitch to stitch in this ditch to get this to catch really even on the back. So what I do is I use the Roxanne glue basted. You can use this for so many different things. Little dots of glue right along the stitching line, all the way through. Fold it over. Make sure that the edge of this folded edge of the fabric is sitting right on the stitching line. And we're going to press. Now I'm pressing this so that the heat of the iron sets the glue. If you were throwing a big quilt over your ironing board and you've got the drag of the quilt, it's probably going to want to pull away. So pop some pins in the end of the quilt in a few places to hold it onto your ironing board. And you will have to take those pins out as you move through the binding and get it all glued down. But it'll just anchor it there for you properly. Now we're getting down to the corner. We're going to just more glue right into the corner. We're going to continue pressing. Till we get to the corner. Then run the glue out on the diagonal, on the 45-degree angle. I use this little tool, it's called an awl. It's really very handy. Hold the awl there and fold that back and we'll just press it. And there we have a perfect corner. We've got a perfect binding with a mitre. So we just keep going all the way around. Now, if you're going to hand stitch that down, we've only used the smallest, littlest dot of glue because I didn't want to put a lot of glue on there because if I do, it's harder for the needle to go through. So just put little dots of glue, little small bits, then you can hand stitch that down. You're not trying to fold this over and hold it. You're not clipping it. You're not pinning it. You've got nothing for your thread to get caught around. It just makes it a really, really easy way to do your binding. If I was, if this was the front of my quilt, this was the right side of the quilt, I would stitch the binding on the wrong side, on the back of the quilt. Then I would roll it over and glue it. Just get that out of the road. Roll it over and glue it like we did on this one. Then I can go to my machine and I can stitch right on the edge here that will then come through to the ditch in the back. I find it's easier to stitch on the edge of the binding than what it is to actually stitch in the ditch of the binding. So that's just a little tip if you want to machine sew your bindings down. And most of the quilts I do these days, I machine stitch my bindings down. I just don't have time to hand stitch. And I'm finding that machine stitching is much stronger. It holds the binding a lot better for me. So give that a go. But a little tip, when I do stitch my bindings down by machine, because I don't want to see that stitching, I have the monopoly invisible thread in my bobbin and in the top of the machine. It just blends into all your fabrics. And the nice thing about this is when you're stitching from the right side of the quilt, you're not going to see the thread on the top. And if you don't stitch right in the ditch on the back, it's not going to show up on your quilting pattern on the back of your quilt. So they're just a few little tips about some of the tools that you could use to make this really, really easy to achieve. Now let's go on to a piping on our binding. Just put this aside. Now there's different ways we can do this, as I said before. We've got two methods. There's the magic, as we call the magic binding, where we're going to use two different widths of fabrics. We're going to use a strip of fabric that is 1.5 inches and one that's 1 3/4. We're going to join those together with a 1/4 inch seam. So we're going to use contrast fabrics. As you can see here, they're quite a nice contrast. They're a 1/4 inch difference. So if you want your binding to be thinner, narrower, because some people do like their binding narrower, just so long as you've got these two strips 1/4 inch difference in size to each other, you'll get the same effect, but you would get a wider or a narrower binding depending on what size you cut your strips. There's no rules. Once you've stitched that all the way down with your 1/4 inch seam, I find that a lot of our threads that we use, they tend to stretch when you start pressing and ironing. So I always go through and set my threads. Takes a little time to just push the iron down on that stitching line. That will set your threads more into the fabric. Then we want to put this out on the ironing board. We want this seam to come over to the widest piece. So we're going to iron this over. Now what we need to do is make sure that these two edges, these two raw edges, align exactly level to each other. So we'll come and we will fold that. And you'll notice there that we've got that little tiny peeper coming out there. We've got that little flange. So just give it a nice little press, about the first 2 inches. Then we're going to use the magic binding tool because it's the right width for the measurements that are in your notes. Come up and back down. And it's so simple to do a binding like this. The only extra step you're taking is this actual seam where you're seaming these two strips together. And it doesn't take long at all to do that, to give you that lovely, lovely finish. Now we're just going to fold those edges so they're together. I like to have this peeper strip facing away from me. I need the raw edges so I can keep an eye on those raw edges that they're even. We're going to put the iron into the curve of the sasha and we're going to push with the iron. And that just folds that strip out absolutely perfect for you. No fuss, no bother, no extra work involved. And definitely when you're doing something like this, just using your fingers, you will be burning your fingers all the way because it stays so hot that it holds the heat, the fabric, and when you go to move on to the next section, you're always burning your fingers. So let us help you out. Use the tool and you'll have no more of those burnt fingers. So there's your strip done with your lovely little flange or peeper. And that's what the other side looks like. So you would stitch that in whichever way you want. You would do your end joins exactly the same. There'd be no problem there. And voila. Now the other method you can use that allows you to adjust the size of your strips is where you would you cut your fabric whatever width you want. Like I've cut these grey strips 1 1/4 inches wide. I've cut this little narrow strip 3/4 of an inch, not 3/4, I cut it 1/2 inch wide. I put this strip through the 3/8 inch tool and folded it first. Then I put them down right sides. The two wider strips go right sides together, and I've got the little strip sandwiched in between, and I've stitched the 1/4 inch all the way through. Then we fold it over, we press the start, we thread it into the 1 1/4 inch regular tool, and we press. That just allows you to make this little strip as wide as you want. And if we look at this quilt on the table here, you will see I've got a much wider strip here. I cut this strip 1 inch wide and put it through the 1/2 inch tool, and then took the 1/4 inch seam. So that gives me a much wider flange than what this one here has. I used the 3/8 of an inch here. Here I used the 1/2. So it just gives you a little bit of an idea of how you can make all your different bindings. So simple. Now, another binding that people use, but it scares people off a lot, is when we're going to bind something with curves. It's hard to get your scallops right. It's hard to get the curves right on the edge of the quilt. So just some little tips. When we've marked the scallops out on this little quilt, we've used our nested circle set. Just put these down here so you can see these. So these are the circles that we use for all sorts of reasons. But you can use any one of these. They come apart. You can just put this down. Now, the good thing about these little tools, they've got little markings all the way around. So you can use those as reference. So you could measure your quilt and then measure these different circles and these markings on the circles to work out what size you want your scallop to be. So we've gone from this marker to this marker because it fitted our quilt perfect. We just come through, and with our fabric marking pencil, we mark the scallops, and you can see we've done that all the way around. Approaching this scalloped edge is exactly like approaching the edge of your quilt. If you find, once you mark your scallops out, that the width of your quilt varies down the quilt, run a gathering stitch around your scallops. Just pull them in slightly so that both ends are exactly the same as the middle. Then we're going to cut our fabric on the bias. Because we've got all these curves, we have to cut it on the bias. Now, I would suggest that the best way for you to learn how to cut your fabric on the bias is go to our YouTube channel, because we have a great video there of how you can cut your fabric on the true bias to be able to get this sort of thing sitting absolutely spot on perfect. We really, really, really need this fabric to be on the true bias. If you're going to be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 threads off the true bias, when you come around these sharp curves like this, you can expect that you're going to get puckering happening down here. And you really don't want that happening. So you don't want to see all these puckers as you stitch this down. You want it to sit beautifully, beautifully flat. So watch that video, learn how to cut your fabric on the true bias, join it exactly as you would for your straight binding, put it through the sasher tool, whatever size you're going to use, exactly like you do for the straight bindings. Then you're simply going to stitch this onto your quilt. Now, I just want to show you a little tip with your corners. And we've got this partially glued down, so I'm just going to pull the glue up. And the glue's great because you can pull it. You can remove it if you've made a mistake. Now, as we're stitching this on, it's okay when we've got a very gentle curve. It's not hard to stitch around there. But when we start getting to a really deep curve, like we have here, it can be a little bit tricky. You've got to have a little mitre in here. So the best way I can suggest for you to get that mitre, and I'll need the camera to come in really, really close here so we can show you what we're going to be doing. So hopefully you can pick up on this. So we're sewing around here. When we get to the tip of the point, and you might like to put a pin or something there where that actual tip right is of that point. Or you might, some sort of marker there. When you get right to that marker, I suggest that you, and the way I do it is I stop there, I lift my foot and I do one stitch across. I leave my needle down in the work, I pivot my quilt a bit, and then I start stitching around the next curve. Now when you do that, it's that one stitch right on that point that really, really helps you get this to sit beautifully. When we put this down now and glue it, before you start gluing it, you may need to nick. Get your good sharp scissors out. I love these scissors because I can get my hand in them. They've got a really, really sharp point. Nip down into there, not to your stitching line. You don't want to cut that stitching line. So I'm about 1/16 of an inch away from that stitching line. That opens that curve out. We will glue around. Once again, we'll press with the iron. Oops, missed that bit there. This is why I like this little iron, because I can get right down into those sort of crevices. A bit easier, and I can see what I'm doing better than what it is with the big iron. Now when we get down to here, oops, just need to get that sitting right. It'll sit right at the front. I just want to flip this over so you can see what's happening at the back. This will automatically fold then into that little mitre for you. So you can see how it's folding over itself. It's better when it's all glued down. And you get that beautiful little mitre. That allows your binding on the bias and around a scallop to sit absolutely beautifully for you. And I just find it's just, and you can see here by this, the way the mitre's come out. And when we look at the front, you can see it's a very, very neat finish. So once again, you could stitch it on from the front, turn it to the back and hand stitch it down. Or you can put it on from the back, fold it over, glue it down and machine stitch right on the edge. Either way, there's no rules. If you were entering in a competition, yes, there would be rules to follow. But if you're just making quilts for yourself, I think it's just choose whatever method is going to work for you. Whatever amount of fabric, because obviously a binding cut on the bias will take up a lot more fabric than what a straight grain bias will take up. And remember, if you've got jelly roll strips left over, even though they've got that pinked edge there, once you fold them and do that first press, they'll go through the tool perfectly. That little serrated edge there that comes from the way that they cut them is not going to affect the tool. It will still fold your bindings absolutely perfect. And there's no quicker, easier way, I don't think, to give yourself a really nice crisp binding to put onto the edge of the quilt. So don't forget, we've got the magic binding sasha tool. We have the 3/8 of an inch one, and that might be an option one that you would like to purchase. And then we've got this 2 sets. So out of this set here, you can basically do any style of binding that you want that will give you an 1.25 inch finish binding. We do have over 20 different size sashes in our range, And, you might like to choose. Have a look on our website, have a look around and choose what is going to suit you best. These are just my hints and tips. If you have another way of doing it, that's fantastic. It's always nice to share knowledge out there, and we never know where we can pick up another good tip from. But visit our website, www.pqw.com.au, and also please go and have a look at our YouTube channel. And I'd love you to subscribe to our YouTube channel because we're getting more and more and more and more and more videos up there every week now. And we're just loving what we're doing, and we've got so much more to share with you. We want to share out our knowledge. Peggy that works for us and myself, between us we have so much quilting experience. We just would love to share it out there with you all. So thank you for joining this class. Don't forget to download your PDF notes. Don't forget that you can buy this tool, this one and this one, the Duo tool and the glue as a kit special for the class. So have a look there, have a look around, send us any questions. We'd love to hear from you. So till next time, happy quilting. Bye.